This is the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. Please excuse the cold that I have, but I'm going to get into now Chapter 6 of Volume 3 of The History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. I'll be lucky. Taping this on my little handheld machine is one thing. I will be pretty lucky if I can get this up on the site, though. My computer died. Had to buy a new computer with money I didn't have, and it's kind of a major. It was kind of a major ordeal to get the audio hooked up last time so that I could have guests on. In that sense, reading these books is a couple of steps easier. I will probably be able to read books, give you guys audiobooks like this sooner than I can have guests on. I got to get the phone patch mixer kit hooked up to the new computer, and man, I'm not a tech guy. It was an ordeal last time. It's going to be an ordeal this time. Probably by the time you hear this, by the time I get this up, I'll have it worked out. Oh, Lord willing. What else is going on? My wife and I are busier than busy in our feudal slavedom. Oh, boy. God did not mean for husband and wife to work outside the home like this, like lunatics. But, you know, folks, the reason my wife and I are working outside the home, both of us, like lunatics, until all hours into the night, scrambling for a babysitter while we're gone. The reason we got to do that, and why you probably have to do that, most of you, the reason is documented in this book, which is why I wanted to get into it. Gustavus Myers tells you, look, folks, it started right off the bat in the history of this country, but it accelerated in the late 1800s. What I mean was rich people gobbling everything up, establishing monopolies, and squashing everybody else, lording it over everybody else, and then through the sinister devices of usury and unjust weights and measures, and all kinds of legal, illegal, and monetary shenanigans, making we, the little people today, have to pay a feudal tax that people in other countries today, and certainly Americans and people of other countries in generations past, would just think we were crazy, just nuts, to pay what we're paying now and to work the hours we're working. It's, in a sense, it's kind of like you go back in time when children were working in factories, when women were working in factories, and the conditions were so brutal. In a sense, it's more same old in a sense. I mean, what are we taxed at now? Isn't it almost like half of our 50%, almost 40 some odd percent? We're slaves. We're slaves. That's not the worst news. There could be worse things than being slaves. The worst thing, what's worse than being a slave, is being a slave and not knowing you're a slave. Being a slave and thinking you're free. And guess what? That's what almost all of the American people are. Slaves thinking they're free. They have it bad. And you can't convince them otherwise. And they're watching CNN and Fox News and reading the major disinformation papers and Newsweek and Time. Joseph Goebbels, if you could resurrect that guy and bring him into America today, man, he would love our media system. I mean, he would get so excited over it. Thrilled. Wow. We're full of Goebbels today in America. Anyway. This book tells you the real history of America, how we got to being slaves today. Feudal slaves without even knowing it. And it also, for me, confirms the Bible. More so than almost any book, any secular book I've ever read. Maybe more so than any secular book I've ever read. Why? Because if I went through the Bible and tallied up all of the verses wherein it is declared that humanity is fallen, humanity is sinful, craven, worthless, without redemption on its own, humanity is, even the best works of men are filthy rags, over and over and over in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we're told. We're living in a fallen world. We're living in a junkyard of a world that used to be not fallen. It didn't used to be a junkyard. And Gustavus Myers, our lying media tells us that rich people, they extol the virtues of these super rich people, generally. And the common man, common idiot on the street gobbles that up, swallows it. Gustavus Myers exposes all that as a lie, shows how, just without fail, all of the rich people were sinful, horrendous people. Now, of course, everybody else was sinful and horrible either. They just didn't have the power to harm others as much as these super rich people. And it just confirms the Bible, man. We're no good. We're bent. We're tweaked. You, me, everybody without Jesus Christ. So this book, which hasn't mentioned Jesus Christ yet, don't know if it will, I'm assuming it won't, and yet to me, man, it confirms the Bible message in droves. Just all over the place. I'm loving this book. Keith Visigoth, he says it's one of his top 5 books of all time. It's going to be in my top 10, and I can't blame him at all for putting it in the top 5. I had a hard time leaving it out of my top 5, just a hard time. Anyway, let's get to the book, huh? Enough of this. I hope I can even get this up on the site. If you guys knew, one more thing. When my computer went down, when it died, I had 3 or 4 shows already, thank you Lord, already in the Dropbox on the website, recorded shows. And so that kept me going, and it is keeping me going once a week. That's why I'm down to 1 show a week. Because of that, I'm trying to string it along to where I don't have to go. So far, I haven't had to go a week without one. But it's real thin right now because when those shows are down, I don't have any more shows, and the new computer, as of right now, is not able to upload any more shows. I haven't formatted it yet, and I'm so tired and busy and stupid, frankly, technologically wise, to where it's going to take me a while to do that. So what I'm saying is, what am I saying? These are tough times right now, in a few ways. And I'm just hoping I'll be able to get this up on the site in time when that time comes. Right now, I got a couple more shows in the Dropbox that are already there. And after that, I don't know. Hopefully I can get this up. I have no idea right now. I could be just reading this to myself for all I know. Chapter 6 of Gustavus Myers, Chapter 6 of Volume 3 of Gustavus Myers is the history of the great American fortunes. The entailing of the Vanderbilt fortune. The richer Commodore Vanderbilt grew, the more closely he clung to his old habits of intense parsimony. I'll bet he did. Occasionally he might ostentatiously give a large sum here or there for some religious or philanthropic purpose, but his general undeviating course was a consistent meanness. In him was united the petty bargaining traits of the trading element and the lavish capacities for plundering of the magnate class. While defrauding on a great scale, pocketing tens of millions of dollars at a single raid, he would never for a moment overlook the leakage of a few cents or dollars. His comprehensive plans for self-aggrandizement were carried out in true piratical style. His aims and demands were for no paltry prize, but for the largest and richest booty. Yet so ingrained by long development was his faculty for acquisition that it far passed the line of a passion and became a monomania. Vanderbilt's characteristics. To such an extent did it corrode him that even when he could boast his 100 million, he still persisted in haggling and huckstering over every dollar, and in tricking his friends in the smallest and most underhanded ways. Friends in the true sense of the word he had none. Those who regarded themselves as such were of that thrifty, congealed disposition, swayed largely by calculation. But if they expected to gain overmuch by their intimacy, they were generally vastly mistaken. Nearly always, on the contrary, they found themselves caught in some unexpected snare, and riper in experience, but poorer in the pocket, they were glad to retire prudently to a safe distance from the old man Vanderbilt's contact. Wrote an admirer of Vanderbilt immediately after Vanderbilt's death, quote, "Friends or foes were pretty much on the same level in his estimation, and if a friend undertook to get in his way, he was obliged to look out for himself," unquote. On one occasion, it is related, when a candidate for a political office solicited a contribution, Vanderbilt gave $100 for himself and an equal sum for a friend associated with him in the management of the New York Central Railroad. A few days later, Vanderbilt informed this friend of the transaction and made a demand for the $100. The money was paid over. Not long after this, the friend in question was likewise approached for a political contribution, whereupon he handed out $100 for himself and the same amount for Vanderbilt. On being told of his debt, Vanderbilt declined to pay it, closing the matter abruptly with his laconic pronunciamento, quote, "When I give anything, I give it myself," unquote. At another time, Vanderbilt assured a friend that he would, quote, unquote, carry 1,000 shares of New York Central stock for him. The market price rose to $115 a share and then dropped to $90. A little later, before setting out to bribe an important bill through the legislature, a bill that Vanderbilt knew would greatly increase the value of the stock, the old magnate went to the friend and represented that since the price of the stock had fallen, it would not be right to subject the friend to a loss. Vanderbilt asked for the return of the stock and got it. Once the bill became a law, the market price of the stock went up tremendously, to the utter dismay of the confiding friend, who saw a profit of $80,000 thus slip out of his hands into Vanderbilt's. In his personal expenses, Vanderbilt usually begrudged what he looked upon as superfluous expense. The plainest of black clothes he wore, and he never countenanced jewelry. He scanned the table bill with a hypercritical eye. Even the sheer necessities of his physical condition could not induce him to pay out money for costly prescriptions. A few days before his death, his physician recommended champagne for some internal trouble. Exclaimed Vanderbilt with a reproachful look, quote, "Champagne? I can't afford champagne. A bottle every morning? Oh, I guess soda water'll do," unquote. From all accounts, it would seem that he diffused about him the same forbidding environment in his own house. He is described as stern, obstinate, masterful and miserly, domineering his household like a tyrant, roaring with fiery anger whenever he was opposed, and flying into fits of fury if his moods, designs, and will were contested. His wife bore him 13 children, 12 of whom she had brought up to maturity. A woman of almost rustic simplicity of mind and of habits, she became obediently meek under the iron discipline he administered. Crawford says of her that she was, quote, "acquiescent and patient under the sway of his dominant will and in the presence of his trying moods," unquote. He goes on, quote, "The fact that she lived harmoniously with such an obstinate man bears strong testimony to her character," unquote. If we are to place credibility in current reports, she was forced time and time again to undergo the most violent scenes in interceding for one of their sons, Cornelius Jeremiah. For the nervous disposition and general bad health of this son, the father had not much sympathy. But the inexcusable crime to him was that Cornelius showed neither inclination nor capacity to engage in a business career. If Cornelius had gambled on the stock exchange, his father would have set him down as an exceedingly enterprising, respectable, and promising man. But he preferred to gamble at cards. This rebellious lack of interest in business, joined with dissipation, so enraged the old man that he drove Cornelius from the house and only allowed him access during nearly a score of years at such rare times as the mother succeeded in her tears and pleadings. Worn out with her long life of drudgery, Vanderbilt's wife died in 1868. About a year later, the old magnate eloped with a young cousin, Frank A. Crawford, and returning from Canada, announced his marriage to the unbounded surprise and utter disfavor of his children. The old magnate's death. An end, however, was soon coming to his prolonged life. A few more years of money heaping, and then, on May 10th, 1876, he was taken mortally ill. For 8 months he lay in bed, his powerful vitality making a vigorous battle for life. 2 physicians died while in the course of attendance on him. It was not until the morning of January 4th, 1877, that the final symptoms of approaching death came over him. When this was seen, the group about his bed emotionally sang, "Come, ye sinners, poor and needy, nearer, my God, to thee, and show ye pity, Lord." He died with a conventional religious end of which the world made much. All the proper sanctities and ceremonials were duly observed. Nothing was lacking in the piety of that affecting deathbed scene. It furnished the text for many a sermon, but while ministerial and journalistic attention was thus eulogistically concentrated upon the loss of America's greatest capitalist, not a reference was made in church or newspaper to the deaths every year of a host of the lowly, slain in the industrial vortex by injury and disease, and too often by suicide and starvation. Except among the lowly themselves, this slaughter passed unprotested and unnoticed. Even as Vanderbilt lay moribund, speculation was busy as to the disposition of his fortune. Who would inherit his aggregation of wealth? The probating of his will soon disclosed that he had virtually entailed it. About $90 million was left to his eldest son, William H., and 1/2 of the remaining $15 million was bequeathed to the chief heir's 4 sons. A few millions were distributed among the founder's other surviving children, and some comparatively small sums bequeathed to charitable and educational institutions. The Vanderbilt dynasty had begun. Personality of the chief heir. At this time, William H. Vanderbilt was 56 years old. Until 1864, he had occupied at farming on Staten Island. He lived at first in a, quote, small, square, plain, 2-story house facing the sea with a lean-to on one end for a kitchen, unquote. The explanation of why the son of a millionaire betook himself to truck farming lay in these facts. The old man despised leisure and luxury, and had a correspondingly strong admiration for, quote, unquote, self-made men. Knowing this, William H. Vanderbilt made a studious policy of standing in with his father, truckling to his every caprice and demand, and proving that he could make an independent living. He is described as a phlegmatic man of dull and slow mental processes, domestic tastes, and of kindly disposition to his children. His father, so the chronicles tell, did not think that he, quote, would ever amount to anything, unquote, but by infinite plodding, exacting the severest labor from his farm laborers, driving close bargains and turning devious tricks in his dealings, he gradually won the confidence and respect of the old man, who was always pleased with proofs of guile. Crawford gives a number of instances of William's craft, and continues, Quote, "From his boyhood, he had given instant and willing submission to the despotic will of his father, and had made boundless sacrifices to please him. Most men would have burst defiantly away from the repressive control and imperious requirements. But he doubtless thought that for the chance of becoming heir to $100 million, he could afford to remain long in the passive attitude of a distrusted prince." Unquote. The old autocrat finally modified his contemptuous opinion and put him in an executive position in the management of the New York and Harlem Railroad. Later, he elevated him to be a sort of coadjutor by installing him as vice president of the New York Central Railroad and as an associate in the directing of other railroads. It was said to be painful to note the exhausting persistence with which William H. Vanderbilt daily struggled to get some perceptions of the details of railroad management. He did succeed in absorbing considerable knowledge, but his training at the hands of his father was not so much in the direction of learning the system of management. Men of ability could always be hired to manage the roads. What his father principally taught him was the more essential astuteness required of a railroad magnate, the manipulation of stocks and of common councils and legislatures, how to fight and overthrow competitors, and extend the sphere of ownership and control, and how best to resist, and if possible to destroy, the labor unions. In brief, his education was a duplication of his father's scope of action. The methods of the sire were infused into the son. From the situation in which he found himself, and viewing the particular traits required in the development of capitalistic institutions, it was the most appropriate training that he could have received. Book erudition and the cultivation of fine qualities would have been sadly out of place. His father's teachings were precisely what were needed to sustain and augment his possessions. On every hand, he was confronted either by competitors who, if they could get the chance, would have stripped him without scruple, or by other men of his own class who would have joyfully defrauded him. But overshadowing these accustomed business practices, new and startling conditions that had to be met and fought were now appearing. Instead of a multitude of small, detached railroads owned and operated by independent companies, the period was now being reached of colossal railroad systems. In the end, the small railroad owners had been well nigh crushed out, and their properties joined in huge lines under the ownership of a few controlling men, while in the West, extensive systems, thousands of miles long, had recently been built. Having stamped out most of the small owners, the railroad barons now proceeded to wrangle and fight among themselves. It was a characteristic period when the railroad magnates were constantly embroiled in the bitterest quarrels, the sole object of which was to outdo, bankrupt, and wreck one another, and seize, if possible, the other's property. The rise of the first trust. It was these conflicts that developed the auspicious time and opportunity for a change of the most worldwide importance, and one which had a stupendous ultimate purport not then realized. The wars between the railroad magnates assumed many forms, not the least of which was the cutting of freight rates. Each railroad desperately sought to wrench away traffic from the others by offering better inducements. In this cutthroat competition, a coterie of hawk-eyed young men in the oil business, led by John D. Rockefeller, saw their fertile chance. The drilling and refining of oil, although in their comparative infancy, had already reached great proportions. Each railroad was eager to get the largest share of the traffic of transporting oil. Rockefeller, ruminating in his small refinery at Cleveland, Ohio, had conceived the revolutionary idea of getting a monopoly of the production and distribution of oil, obliterating the middleman, and systematizing and centralizing the whole business. Then and there was the modern trust born, and from the very inception of the Standard Oil Company, Rockefeller and his associates tenaciously pursued their design with a combined ability and unscrupulousness such as had never before been known since the rise of capitalism. One railroad after another was persuaded or forced into granting them secret rates and rebates against which it was impossible to compete. The railroad magnates, William H. Vanderbilt, for instance, were taken in the fold of the Standard Oil Company by being made stockholders. With these secret rates, the Standard Oil Company was enabled to crush out absolutely a myriad of competitors and middlemen, and control the petroleum trade not only of the United States, but of almost the entire world. Such fabulous profits accumulated that in the course of 40 years, after one unending career of industrial construction on the one hand and crime on the other, the Standard Oil Company was easily able to become owners of prodigious railroad and other systems, and completely supplant the scions of the magnates whom 3 or 4 decades before they had wheedled or browbeaten into favoring them with discriminations. Corporate wealth and labor unions. The effects of this great industrial transition were clearly visible by 1877, so much so that 2 years later, Vanderbilt, more prophetically than he realized, told the Hepburn Committee that, quote, "If this thing keeps up, the oil people will own the roads," unquote. But other noted industrial changes were concurrently going on. With the upspringing and growth of gigantic combinations or concentrations of capital, and the gradual disappearance of the small factors in railroad and other lines of business, workers were compelled by the newer conditions to organize on large and compact national lines. At first, each craft was purely local and disassociated from other trades unions. But comprehending the inadequacy and futility of existing separately, and of acting independently of one another, The unions had, some years back, begun to weld themselves into one powerful body, covering much of the United States. Each craft union still retained its organization and autonomy, but it now became part of a national organization embracing every form of trades and centrally officered and led. It was in this way that the workers, step by step, met the organization of capital. The two forces, each representing a conflicting principle, were thus prepared for a series of great industrial battles. Capital had the wealth, resources, and tools of the country. The workers their labor power only. As it stood, it was an uneven contest, with every advantage in favor of capital. The workers could decline to work, but capital could starve them into subjection. These, however, were but the apparent differences. The real and immense difference between them was that capital was in absolute control of the political governing power of the nation, and this power, strange to say, it secured by the votes of the very working class constantly fighting it in the industrial arena. Same thing going on today, folks. Many years were to elapse before the workers were to realize that they must organize and vote with the same political solidarity that they long had been developing in industrial matters. With political power in their hands, the capitalists could, and did, use its whole weight with terrific effect to beat down the working class and nullify most of the few concessions and laws obtained by the workers after the severest and most self-sacrificing struggles. One of the first memorable battles between the two hostile forces came about in 1877. In their rate wars, the railroad magnates had cut incisively into one another's profits. The permanent gainers were such incipient, or fairly well-developed, trusts or combinations as the Standard Oil Company. Now the magnates set about asserting the old capitalist principle of recouping themselves by forcing the workers to make up their losses. But these deficits were merely relative. Practically every railroad had issued vast amounts of bonds and watered stock on which fixed charges and dividends had to be paid. Judged by the extent of this inflated stock, the profits of the railroads had certainly decreased. Despite, however, the prevailing cutthroat competition and the slump in general business following the panic of 1873, the railroads were making large sums on their actual investment, so-called. Most of this investment, it will be recalled, was not private money, but was public funds, which were later stolen by corrupt legislation. It was shown before the Hepburn Committee in 1879, as we have noted, that from 1869 the New York Central Railroad had been making 16 and perhaps more than 20% on the actual cost of the road. Moreover, apart from the profits from ordinary traffic, the railroads were annually fattening on immense sums of public money gathered in by various fraudulent methods. One of these, and is well worth adverting to, for it exists to a greater degree than ever before, was the robbery of the people in the transportation of mails. By a fraudulent official construction in 1873, of the postal laws, the railroads, without cessation, have cheated huge sums in falsifying the weight of mail carried, and since that time have charged 10 times as much for mail carrying as have the express companies, parentheses, the profits of which are very great, end parentheses, for equal haulage. But these are simply two phases of the postal plunder. In addition to the regular mail payments, the government has long paid to the railroad companies an extra allowance of $6,250 a year for the rent of each postal car used, although official investigation has proved that the whole cost of constructing such a car averages from $2,500 to $5,000. In rent alone, $5 million a year have been paid for cars worth, all told, about $4 million. From official estimates, it would clearly seem that the railroads have long cheated the people out of at least $20 million a year in excess rates, a total of perhaps $500 million since 1873. The Vanderbilt family have been among the chief beneficiaries of this continuous looting. Occasionally, the postal officials have made pretenses at stopping the plunder, but with no real effect. The Great Strike of 1877. Making a loud and plaintive outcry about their declining revenues, some of the railroad systems prepared to assess their fictitious losses upon the workers by cutting down wages. They had already reduced wages to the point of the merest subsistence, and now they decreed that wages must again be curtailed 10 cents on every dollar. The Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, then in the hands of the Garrett family, with a career behind it of consecutive political corruption and fraud, in some ways surpassing that of the Vanderbilts, led in reducing the wages of its workers. The Pennsylvania Railroad followed, and then the Vanderbilts gave the order for another reduction. At once, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad employees retaliated by declaring a strike. The example was followed by the Pennsylvania men. In order to alienate the sympathy of the general public, and to have a pretext for suppressing the strike with armed force, the railroads, it is quite certain, instigated riots at Martinsburg, West Virginia, and at Pittsburgh. Troops were called out, and the so-called mobs were fired on, resulting in a number of strikers being killed and many wounded. Why don't they ever tell us that history in school, folks? That the railroads deliberately destroyed their own property and then charged the culpability to the strikers was common report. Boy, that's false flag operations right there, folks. Those go way back. And yet, Orwell was the only one who told us that they were coming in greater degree later on. So conservative an authority as Carroll D. Wright, for a long time United States Commissioner of Labor, tells of the railroad agents setting a large number of old, decayed, worthless freight cars at Pittsburgh on fire and accusing the strikers of the act, false flag operation. He further tells of the Pennsylvania Railroad subsequently extorting millions of dollars from the public treasury on the ground that the destruction of these cars resulted from riot. Wright says that from all that he has been able to gather, he believes the reports of the railroad manufacturing riots to have been true. Vanderbilt acted with greater wisdom than his fellow magnates. Adopting a conciliatory stand, he averted a strike on his lines by restoring the old rate of wages and by other mollifying measures. He was now assailed from a different direction. The long-gathering anger and enmity of the various sections of the middle class against the corporate wealth which had possessed itself of so dictatorial a power culminated in a manner as instructive as it was ineffective. In New York State, the legislature was prevailed upon in 1879 to appoint an investigating committee. Vanderbilt and other railroad owners and a multitude of complaining traders were hailed up to give testimony. The stock-jobbing transactions of Vanderbilt and Gould were fully and tediously gone into, as also were the methods of the railroads in favoring certain corporations and mercantile establishments with secret preferential freight rates. Not in the slightest did this long-drawn investigation have any result calculated to break the power of the railroad owners or their predominant grip upon governmental functions. The magnate class preferred to have no official inquiries. There was always the annoying possibility that in some state or other inconvenient laws might be passed, or harassing legal actions begun, and while revocation or amendment of these laws could be put through subsequently when the popular excitement had died away, and the suits could be in some way defeated, the exposures had an inflaming effect upon a population as yet ill-used to great one-man power of wealth. But if the middle class insisted upon action against the railroad magnates, there was no policy more suitable to these magnates than that of being investigated by legislative committees. They were not averse to their opponents amusing themselves and finding a vent for their wrath in volumes of talk which began nowhere and ended nowhere. Sounds like congressional inquiries today. It's just designed to let the heat out of the kitchen, that's it. They never find anything, almost never, and even when they do, nothing results. In reply to charges, the magnates could put in their skillful defense and inject such a maze of argument, pettifoggery, and technicalities into the proceedings that before long the public, tired of the puzzle, was bound to throw up its hands in sheer bewilderment, unable to get any concrete idea of what it was all about. Folks, that is still the strategy today. Listen to that part again, rewind it, because that still happens today. Fraud becomes respectable wealth. So the great investigation of 1879 passed by without the least deterrent effect upon the constantly spreading power and wealth of such men as Vanderbilt and Gould. Every new development revealed that the hard-dying middle class was being gradually, yet surely, ground out. But the investigation of 1879 had one significant, unanticipated result. What William H. Vanderbilt now did is well worth noting. As the owner of 400,000 shares of New York Central stock, he had been rabidly denounced by the middle class as a plutocrat dangerous to the interests of the people. He decided that it would be wise to sell a large part of this stock. By this stroke, he could advantageously exchange the forms of some of his wealth. Pardon my washer in the background, folks. I'm in the garage. I'm one voice in the wilderness. I'm a one-horse operation, and I am the ministry. There, I've admitted it. Okay. He decided that it would be wise to sell a large part of the stock. By this stroke, he could advantageously exchange the forms of some of his wealth and be able to put forward the plausible claim that the New York Central Railroad, far from being a one-man institution, was owned by a large number of investors. In November 1879, he sold, through J. Pierpont Morgan, more than 200,000 shares to a syndicate, chiefly, however, to British aristocrats. How lovely. This sale in no way diminished his actual control of the New York Central Railroad. Not only did he retain a sufficient number of shares, but he owned an immense block of the railroad's bonds. The sale of the stock brought him $35 million. What did he do with this sum? He at once reinvested it in the United States government bonds. Thus, the proceeds of a part of the stock obtained by outright fraud, either by his father or himself, were put into government bonds. This surely was a very sagacious move. Stocks do not have the solid, honest air that government bonds do. Nothing is more finely and firmly respectable than a government bondholder. From the blackmailer, corruptionist, and defrauder of one generation to the stolid government bondholder of the next was not a long step, but it was a sufficient one. The process of investing in government bonds Vanderbilt continued. In a few years, he owned not less than $54 million worth of 4%. In 1884, he had to sell $10 million of them to make good the losses incurred by his sons on the stock exchange, but later he bought $10 million more. Also, he owned $4 million in government 3.5% bonds, many millions of state and city bonds, several millions of dollars in manufacturing stocks and mortgages, and $22 million of railroad bonds. This is why in the Old Testament God called for a Jubilee year. You wipe the slate clean, and these super rich, you don't get any super rich. They're wiped out. Clean slate. The oppression is lifted. The oppression is never lifted in the Babylonian American system of today. The same government of which Vanderbilt's father had defrauded millions of dollars now stood as a direct guarantee behind at least $70 million of his bonded wealth, and the whole population of the United States was being taxed to pay interest on bonds, the purchase of which was an outgrowth of the theft of public money committed by Cornelius Vanderbilt. In the following years, after his father's death, William H. Vanderbilt found no difficulty in adding more extended railroad lines to his properties and in increasing his wealth by tens of millions of dollars at a leap. More railroads acquired. The impact of his vast fortune was well nigh resistless. Commanding both financial and political power, his money and resources were used with destructive effect against almost every competitor standing in his way. If he could not coerce the owners of a railroad, the possession of which he sought, to sell him at his own price, he at once brought into action the wrecking tactics his father had so successfully used. The West Shore Railroad, a competing line running along the west bank of the Hudson River, was bankrupted by him, and finally, in 1883, bought in under foreclosure proceedings. By lowering his freight rates, he took away most of its business. Through a series of years, he methodically caused it to be harassed and burdened by the exercise of his great political power. He thwarted its plans and secretly hindered it in its application for money loans or other relief. Other means, open and covert, were employed to ensure its ruination. When, at last, he had driven its owners into a corner, he calmly stepped in and bought up its control cheaply, and then turned out many millions of dollars of watered stock. He attempted to break in upon the territory traversed by the Pennsylvania Railroad by building a competing line, the South Pennsylvania Railroad. In the construction of this road, he had an agreement with the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, an intense competitor of the Pennsylvania. And, as a precedent to building his line, he obtained a large interest in the Reading Railroad. Out of this arrangement grew a highly important sequence which few then foresaw. The gradual assumption by the Vanderbilt family of a large share of the ownership and control of the anthracite coal mines of Pennsylvania. Vanderbilt, aiming at sharing in the profits from the rich coal, oil, and manufacturing traffic of Pennsylvania, went ahead with his building of the South Pennsylvania line. But there was an easy way of getting millions of dollars before the road was even opened. This was the fraudulent one, so widely practiced, of organizing a bogus construction company and charging 3 or 4 times more than the building of the railroad actually cost. Vanderbilt got together a dummy construction company composed of some of his clerks and brokers and advanced the sum of about $6.5 million to build the road. In return, he ordered this company to issue $20 million in bonds and the same amount in stock. Of this $40 million in securities, more than $30 million was loot. If, however, Vanderbilt anticipated that the Pennsylvania Railroad would remain docile or passive while his competitive line was being built, he soon learned how sorely mistaken he was. This time he was opposing no weak, timorous, or unsophisticated competitors, but a group of the most powerful and astute organizers and corruptionists. Their methods in Pennsylvania and other states were exactly the same as Vanderbilt's in New York State. Their political power was as great in their chosen province as his in New York. His incursion into the territory they had apportioned to themselves for exploitation was not only resented but fiercely resisted. Presently, overwhelmed by the crushing financial and political weapons with which they fought him, Vanderbilt found himself compelled to compromise by disposing of the line to them. The sequel to a quote-unquote gentleman's agreement. Vanderbilt's methods and his duplicity in the disposition of this project were strikingly revealed in the court proceedings instituted by the state of Pennsylvania. It appeared from the testimony that he had made a quote-unquote gentleman's agreement with the Reading Railroad, the bitterest competitor of the Pennsylvania Railroad, for a close alliance of interests. Vanderbilt owned 82,000 shares of Reading stock, much of which he had obtained on this agreement. Strangely confiding in his word, the Reading management proceeded to expend large sums of money in building terminals at Harrisburg and elsewhere to make connections with his proposed South Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania Railroad, however, set about retaliating in various effective ways. At this point, J. Pierpont Morgan, whose career we shall duly describe, stepped boldly in. Morgan was Vanderbilt's financial agent, and it was he, according to his testimony, on October 13, 1885, before the court examiner, who now suggested and made the arrangements between Vanderbilt and the Pennsylvania Railroad magnates by which the South Pennsylvania Railroad was to become the property of the Pennsylvania system, and the Reading Railroad magnates were to be as thoroughly thrown over by as a deft stroke of treachery as had ever been put through in the business world. To their great astonishment, the Reading owners woke up one morning to find that Vanderbilt and his associates had completely betrayed them by disposing of a majority of the stock of the partly built South Pennsylvania line to the Pennsylvania Railroad system for $5,600,000 in 3% railroad debenture bonds. It is interesting to inquire who Vanderbilt's associates were in this transaction. They were John D. Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, D.O. Mills, Stephen B. Elkins, William C. Whitney, and other founders of large fortunes. For once in his career, Vanderbilt met in the Pennsylvania Railroad a competitor powerful enough to force him to compromise. Elsewhere, Vanderbilt was much more successful. Out through the fertile wheat, corn, and cattle sections of Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Dakota, and Nebraska, ran the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad, a line 4,000 miles long, which had been built mostly by public funds and land grants. Its history was a succession of corrupt acts in legislatures and in Congress, and comprised the usual process of stock watering and exploitation. By a series of manipulations ending in 1880, Vanderbilt secured a controlling interest in this railroad so that he had a complete line from New York to Chicago and thence far into the Northwest. During these years, he also secured control of other railroad lines. He expands in splendor. It was at this time that he, in accord with the chrysalid tendency manifested by most other millionaires, discarded his long-followed somber method of life and invested himself with a gaudy magnificence. On Fifth Avenue, at 51st and 52nd Streets, he built a spacious brownstone mansion. In reality, it was a union of two mansions. The southern part he planned for himself, the northern part for his two daughters. For a year and a half more than 600 artisans were employed on the interior. 60 stone workers were imported from Europe. The capaciousness, the glitter, and the cluttering of splendor in the interior were regarded as of unprecedented lavishness in the United States. All of the luxury overloading these mansions was, as was well known, the fruit of fraud piled upon fraud. It represented the spoliation, misery, and degradation of the many. But none could deny that Vanderbilt was fully entitled to it by the laws of a society which decreed that its rulers should be those who could best use and abuse it. And rulers must ever live imperiously and impressively. It is not fitting that those who command the resources, labor, and government of a nation should issue their mandates from pinched and meager surroundings. Mere pseudo-political rulers, such as governors and presidents, are expected to be satisfied with the plain, unornamental official residences provided by the people. Thereby they keep up the appearance of that much bespoken Republican simplicity which is part of the mask of political formulas. Luckily for themselves, the financial and industrial rulers are bound by no circumscribing tradition. Hence, they have no set of buckrammed rules to stick close to for fear of an indignant electorate. The same populace that glowers and mutters whenever its political officials show an inclination to pomp, regards it as perfectly natural that its financial and industrial rulers should body forth all of the most obtrusive evidences of grandeur. Boy, the people are they worship wealth. People worship wealth. They always have, they always will. People are fools. Most people. Those Vanderbilt twin palaces, still occupied by the Vanderbilt family, were appropriately built and fitted, and are more truly and specifically historic as the abode of government than official mansions. For it is the magnates who have been, in these modern times, the real rulers of nations. Thank you, Gustavus. Ding, 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 you nailed it. It is the magnates, the financiers, who have been the real rulers in modern times. You got it. It is they who have usually been able to decide who the political ruler should be. Political parties have been simply their adjuncts. CFR, folks, this is before Rockefeller set up the CFR. Gustavus Myers was calling it way back then. The halls of legislation and the courts, their mouthpieces and registering bureaus. Theirs has been the power, under cover though it has lurked, of elevating or destroying public officials and of approving or canceling legislation. Why, indeed, should they not have their gilded palaces? A sudden transformation. The President of the United States lived in the subdued simplicity of the White House. But William H. Vanderbilt ate in a great lofty dining room, 26 by 37 feet, wrought in Italian Renaissance, with a wainscot of golden-hued, delicately carved English oak around on all four sides, and a ceiling with richly painted hunting scene panels. When he entertained, it was in a vast drawing-room, palatially equipped, its walls hung with flowing masses of pale red velvet, embroidered with foliage flowers and butterflies, and set with crystals and precious stones. It was his art gallery, however, which flattered him most. He knew nothing of art, and underneath his pretensions cared less. for he was a complete utilitarian. But it had become fashionable to have an elaborate art gallery, and he forthwith disbursed money right and left to assemble an aggregation of paintings. He gave orders to agents for their purchase with the same equanimity that he would contracts for railroad supplies, and as a rule, the more generous in size the canvases, the more satisfied he was that he was getting his money's worth. Art to him meant buying by the square foot. Not a few of the paintings unloaded upon him were, despite their high-sounding reputations, essentially commonplace subjects, and flashy and hackneyed in execution. But he gloried in the celebrity that came from the high prices he was decoyed into paying for them. For one of Meissonier's paintings, The Arrival at the Chateau, he paid $40,000, and on one of his visits to Paris he enriched Meissonier to the extent of $188,000 for 7 paintings. Not until his corps of art advisors were satisfied that a painter became fashionably talked about could Vanderbilt be prevailed upon to buy examples of his work. There was something intensely magical in the ease and cheapness with which he acquired the reputation of being a, quote, connoisseur of art, unquote. Neither knowledge nor appreciation were required. With the expenditure of a few $100,000, he instantaneously transformed himself from a heavy-witted, uncultured money hoarder into the character of a surpassing, quote, judge and patron of art, unquote. I love this book. Oh, I want to go back in time and meet Gustavus Myers, my kind of historian and author and writer. And Vanderbilt's pretensions, William Vanderbilt, were seriously accepted by the uninformed, absorbing their opinions from the newspapers, of course. Quote, the public be damned, unquote. If he had discreetly comported himself in other respects, he might have passed tolerably well as an extremely public-spirited and philanthropic man. After every great fraud that he put through, he would usually throw out to the public some ostentatious gift or donation. This would furnish a new ground to the sycophantic chorus for extolling his fine qualities. But he happened to inherit his father's irascibility and extreme contempt for the public whom he exploited. Unfortunately for him, he let out on one memorable occasion his real sentiments. Asked by a reporter why he did not consider public convenience in the running of his trains, he blurted out, quote, the public be damned, unquote. There you go. There you go. Elitist. It was assuredly a superfluous question and answer, but expressed so sententiously, and published as it was throughout the length and breadth of the land, it excited deep popular resentment. He was made the target for general denunciation and execration, although unreasonably so, for he had but given candid and succinct utterance to the actuating principle of the whole capitalist class. The moral of this incident impressed itself sharply upon the minds of the masterly rich, and to this day has greatly contributed to the politic manner of their exterior conduct. They learned that, however in private they might safely sneer at the mass of the people, as created for their manipulation and enrichment, they must not declare so publicly. Far wiser is it, they have come to understand, to confine spoliation to action, while in outward speech affirming the most mellifluous and touching professions of solicitude for public interests. Adds $100 million in 7 years. But William H. Vanderbilt was little affected by this outburst of public rage. He could well afford to smile cynically at it, so long as no definite move was taken to interfere with his privileges, power, and possessions. Since his father's death, he had added fully $100 million to his wealth, all within a short period. It had taken Commodore Vanderbilt more than 30 years to establish the fortune of $105 million he left. With a greater population and greater resources to prey upon, William H. Vanderbilt almost doubled the amount in 7 years. In January 1883, he confided to a friend that he was worth $194 million. Quote, "I am the richest man in the world," unquote. He went on, quote, "In England, the Duke of Westminster is said to be worth $200 million, but it is mostly in land and houses and does not pay 2%, unquote. In the same breath that he boasted of his wealth, he would bewail the ill health condemning him to be a victim of insomnia and indigestion. Having a clear income of $10,350,000 per year, he kept his ordinary expenses down to $200,000 a year. Whatever an air of indifference he would assume in his grandee role of quote-unquote art collector, yet in most other matters he was inveterately close-fisted. He had a delusion that, quote, everybody in the world was ready to take advantage of him, unquote, and he regarded, quote, men and women, as a rule, as a pretty bad lot, unquote. This incident, one of many similar incidents narrated by Crawford, reveals his microscopic vigilance in detecting impositions. Quote, when in active control of affairs at the office, he followed the unwholesome habit of eating the midday lunch at his desk, the waiter bringing it in from a neighboring restaurant. He paid his bill for this weekly, and he always scrutinized the items with proper care. Quote, was I here last Thursday? Unquote, he asked of a clerk at an adjoining desk. Quote, no, Mr. Vanderbilt, you stayed at home that day, unquote. Quote, so I thought, unquote, he said, and struck that day from the bill. Another time he would exclaim, sotto voce, quote, I didn't order coffee last Tuesday, unquote, and that item would vanish. Up to the very, unquote on that, up to the very last second of his life, his mind was filled with a whirl of business schemes. It was while discussing railroad plans with Robert Garrett in his mansion on December 8, 1885, that he suddenly shot forward from his chair and fell apoplectically to the floor, and in a twinkling was dead. Servants ran to and fro excitedly. Messengers were dispatched to summon his sons. Telegrams flashed the intelligence far and wide. The passing away of the greatest of men could not have received a tithe of the excitement and attention caused by William H. Vanderbilt's death. The newspaper offices hotly issued page after page of description, not without sufficient reason. For, although untitled and vested with no official power, was in actuality he an autocrat. Dictatorship by money bags was an established fact. And while the man died, his corporate wealth, the real director and center, to a large extent, of government functions, survived unimpaired. He had abundantly proved his autocracy. Law after law he violated. Like his father, he had corrupted and intimidated, had bought laws, ignored such as were unsuited to his interests, and had decreed his own rules and codes. Progressively bolder had the money kings become in coming out into the open in the directing of government. Long had they prudently skulked behind forms, devices, and shams. They had operated secretly through tools in office, while virtuously disclaiming any insidious connection with politics. But no observer took this pretense seriously. James Bryce, fresh from England, delving into the complexities and incongruities of American politics at about this time, wrote that, quote, "These railway kings are among the greatest men, perhaps I may say, the greatest men in America," unquote. Which term, quote-unquote, greatest, was a ludicrously reverent way of describing their qualities. He goes on in the same work, quote, "They have power, that is, more opportunity to make their will prevail, than perhaps anyone in political life, except the President or the Speaker, who, after all, hold theirs only for 4 years and 2 years, while the railroad monarch holds his for life," unquote. Bryce was not well enough acquainted with the windings and depths of American political workings to know that the money kings had more power than President or Speaker, not nominally, but essentially. Hear, hear. He further relates how, when a railroad magnate traveled, his journey was like a royal progress. Governors of states and territories bowed before him. Legislatures received him in solemn session. Cities and towns sought to propitiate him, for had he not the means of making or marring a city's fortunes? Wrote Richard T. Ely a little later, quote, "You cannot turn in any direction in American politics without discovering the railway power. It is the power behind the throne. It is a correct popular instinct which designates the leading men in the railways, railroad magnates or kings. Its power ramifies in every direction, its roots reaching counting rooms, editorial sanctums, schools and churches which it supports with a part of its revenues, as well as courts and legislatures," unquote. His death, a notable event. Vanderbilt's death, as that of one of the real monarchs of the day, was an event of transcendent importance and was treated so. The vocabulary was ransacked to find adjectives glowing enough to describe his enterprise, foresight, sagacity, and integrity. Much elaborated upon was the fiction that he had increased his fortune by honest, legitimate means. A fiction still disseminated, by those shallow or mercenary writers whose trade is to spread orthodox belief in existing conditions. The underlying facts of his career and methods were purposely suppressed, and a nauseating sort of panegyric substituted. Who did not know that he had bribed legislature after legislature, and had constantly resorted to conspiracy and fraud? Not one of his eulogists was innocent of this knowledge. The record of it was too public and palpable to justify doubts of its truth. The extent of his possessions and the size of his fortune aroused wonderment, but no effort was made to contrast the immense wealth bequeathed by one man with the dire poverty on every hand, nor to connect those two conditions. At the very time his wealth was being inventoried at $200 million, not less than 1 million wage earners were out of employment, while the millions at work received the scantiest of wages. Nearly 3 millions of people had been completely pauperized, and in one way or another had to be supported at public expense. Once in a rare while, some perceptive and unshackled public official might pierce the sophistries of the day and reveal the cause of this widespread poverty, as Iris Stewart did in the 4th annual report of the Massachusetts Bureau of Statistics of Labor for 1873. He pointedly wrote, quote, "It is the enormous profits made directly upon the labor of the wage classes, and indirectly through the results of their labor, that first keeps them poor, and second furnishes the capital that is finally loaned back to them again, at rates of high interest." Unquote. Unquestionably sound and true was this explanation. Yet of what avail was it if the causes of their poverty were withheld from the active knowledge of the mass of the wage workers? It was the special business of the newspapers, the magazines, the pulpit, and the politicians to ignore, suppress, or twist every particle of information that might enlighten or arouse the mass of people. If these agencies were so obtuse or recalcitrant as not to know their expected place and duty at critical times, they were quickly reminded of them by the propertied classes. To any newspaper owner, clergyman, or politician showing a tendency to radicalism, the punishment came quickly. The newspaper owner was deprived of advertisements and accommodations. The clergyman was insidiously hounded out of his pulpit by his church associations, the funds of which came from men of wealth. And the politician was ridiculed and was summarily retired to private life by corrupt means. As for genuinely honest administrative officials, as distinguished from the apparently honest, who opposed prevalent conditions and sought to remedy them in their particular departments, they were eventually got rid of by a similar campaign of calumny and corrupt influences, his frauds in evading taxes. As in the larger sense, all criticism of conditions was systematically smothered. So were details of the methods of the rich carefully obscured or altogether passed by in silence. At Vanderbilt's death, the newspapers laved in gorgeous descriptions of his mansion. Yet, apart from the proceeds of his great frauds, the amounts out of which he had cheated the city and state in taxation, were alone much more than enough to have paid for his splendor of living. Like the Astors, the Golets, Marshall Field, and every other millionaire without exception, he continuously defrauded in taxes. We have seen how the Vanderbilts seized hold of tens of millions of dollars of bonds by fraud. Certain of their railroad stocks were exempted from individual taxation, but railroad bonds ranked as taxable personal property. Year after year, William H. Vanderbilt had perjured himself in swearing that his personal property did not exceed $500,000. On more than this amount, he would not pay. When, at his death, his will revealed to the public the proportions of his estate, the New York City Commissioners of Assessments and Taxes made an apparent effort to collect some of the millions of dollars out of which he had cheated the city. It was now that the obsequious and time-serving Depew, grown gray and wrinkled in the retainership of the Vanderbilt generations, came forward with this threat. Quote, "He informed us," unquote, testified Michael Coleman, president of the commission, quote, "that if we attempted to press too hard, he would take proceedings by which most of the securities would be placed beyond our reach so that we could not tax them. The Vanderbilt family could convert everything they had into non-taxable securities, such as New York Central, government and city bonds, Delaware and Lackawanna and Delaware and Western Railroad stocks, and pay not a dollar provided they wished to do so," unquote. The Vanderbilt estate compromised by paying the city a mere part of the sum owed. It succeeded in keeping the greatest part of its possessions immune from taxation, in doing which it but did what the whole of the large propertied class was doing, as was disclosed in further detailed testimony before the New York Senate Committee on Cities in 1890. His will transmits $200 million. Unlike his father, William H. Vanderbilt did not bequeath the major portion of his fortune to one son. He left $50 million equally to each of his two sons, Cornelius and William K. Vanderbilt, supplementing the fortunes they already had. These legacies swelled their individual fortunes to approximately $100,000 each, about the same amount as their father had himself inherited. The remaining 100 million. The remaining 100 million each, and the remaining 100 million was thus disposed of in William H. Vanderbilt's will. 40 million in railroad and other securities was set apart as a trust fund, the income of which was to be apportioned equally among each of his 8 children. This provided them each with an annual income of $500,000. In turn, the principal was to descend to their children as they should direct by will. Another 40 million was shared outright among his 8 children. The remaining 20 million was variously divided, the greater part to his widow, 2 million as an additional gift to Cornelius, 1 million to a favorite grandson, sundry items to other relatives and friends, and about 1 million to charitable and public institutions. He was buried in a mausoleum costing $300,000, which he himself had ordered to be built at Newdorp, Staten Island. And there today his ashes lie, splendidly interred, while millions of the living, plundered and disinherited, are suffered to live in the deadly congestion of miserable habitations. Oh boy. All right, folks. You've been listening to the Ministry of Truth. I'm Gordon Comstock. That was Chapter 6 of Volume 3 of the History of the Great American Fortunes by Gustavus Myers. It's all history that you're not supposed to know about. So now you're hearing it on audio. Well, wow. I guess if you've gotten this far, you're not one of those people who email me and complain about me reading books. You're not one of those attention span challenged. Never mind, I'll stop there. I know a few of you out there enjoy this, those of you with brains. Okay, I didn't stop. All right, thanks for listening. Bye-bye.